this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to part 2 of my discussion with Teresa Lynch, Vice President of Field Operations at Lennar. We pick up our conversation with Teresa talking about the strategies she employs to promote effective communication and collaboration among her team members.
I mean, it's lead by example, right? Like I try to really come at things looking at everything I learned being in their shoes. First of all, like what leaders did I want to follow? What leaders made me think I don't want this job? I don't like this job. This is not for me. Like, how do I reconcile that, but also recognizing that each person is not me, right? Each person might have a different approach. So I really try to lead by example and creating that vulnerability so that, we can focus on building team containers, whether it's project team container or your regular, team containers. And how do you make it so that you're creating a space that when things are bad, the container doesn't break, right? It's not a crack because you're all holding it together. And so we spend a lot of time getting to know each other. We spend a lot of time, we probably have a lot of like inside jokes and a lot of like funny sayings because you're, sitting in a meeting and somebody feels okay to like, oh, haha, I'm going to laugh at that, right? I'm going to laugh in this moment. I'm not going to freak out. I'm not going to have a stress. And we're going to laugh at it because it's what we can do. We know we'll fix it on the backside, right? So I think that vulnerability piece is really important in how we build it. I think the other piece is you have to talk it and live it. You can't just say, oh, I want this culture. I want this team to be this way. That's an active thing, right? It's an active thing with how you react when something slips. It's an active thing with how you react when somebody is like, I decided to go do this instead of this, and they don't need a commitment. Like each one of those is an opportunity to build the culture and to build what you want and how you want it to happen, each time. So I think it's being very present, being very active, being very focused on what I'm going to call the art of project management, not the science. To your point, it's not the black and white, here we go, but what are all of those little gray areas in between about how we do it together and what it means together. And I tend to come at it, I'm your warrior. Like I'm here to clear the path for you. Like my job is to, as either an executive or as a project leader, my job is to make sure that you can be successful. And so I think once teams know that, they tend to also want to make you successful, right? They tend to say, oh, okay, well, gosh, like she's out there doing that for me. He's out there doing that for me. He's got our back. We've built this team that I know each person, and I know they have my back and they get my story and they get who I am and they get what I bring to the table. Yes, like nobody is looking the other way. They are focused and they want to actually get to that same goal line together, right? They want to run the play. They want to get there.
Yeah, I think that people often ask me, how long does this process take to inculcate at an organization? And I tell them usually the first project, people are reluctant because they think, yeah, I've heard all this before about pick my own duration and I'll let you change it later. But I know what really happens is it's cast in stone and I'm used to club me over the head with for the remainder of the project. I'm never able to really change it. And usually it takes that one iteration where they go, oh, Teresa was telling the truth. So I was able to change it. Not only that, but she was able to sit me down and say, look, Clint, I know that you have 15 items on your to-do list this next week. And I know you're good, but I know you're not that good. So let's talk about which ones can you get done, which ones are the most important to us to get done. And the rest, because we understand the schedule, we know there's slack or float, we can actually delay those rather than just pounding you to get all 15 done. It's about realizing not all 15 are equally important. There's 2 that have got to be done or we're going to be in trouble. But the other 13, we actually have a little flexibility. We can move those. And then once I've begun to realize that the project manager, let's use your words, has my back, then I'm going to die on that hill for you every time.
Right. And you just brought up a great point, which is transparency, right? How do you create transparency without punishment? And I think too often, right? In bad projects, that's the first thing. The minute I'm transparent, I'm getting punished, right? I'm
Shoot the messenger.
Right, exactly. And so how do you focus on that? And you focus on it by what you just said. Like, it's the conversation. It's that transparency of like, this is how it works. This is how it's going to work. Like setting that up, being able to say, okay, no, I get it. I get it. I get it. I get it. Now let's work together to still figure out how we get here. Like it's that just constant communication. And I'll go back to, you have the data to do that. It's not, awkward conversations like, well, Clint, you didn't seem very engaged today. Like it's, it's, hey, Clint, I looked at your estimated finish over here and we're slipping. Like, okay, let's talk about that. Can we do anything over here? Can I help you here? What needs to happen? This is the one thing that needs to be pulled back in. Like that one's not going to fly. The other ones, we're not going to worry about. They're not on the critical path. Like it goes back to being able to use that data that takes out a lot of that emotional kind of personal, I'm going to read the tea leaves thing that happens sometimes.
I think the transparency and the trust is so important because I've been on a project where that exact situation was happening, where they were slipping. And for those who don't like terms like that, it just means they were getting later and later on their task. And I asked them, I said, hey, look, in the past, you've always been Johnny on the spot. I've been able to trust you. What can I do to help you? And finally, the person looked at me and said, Clint, I have to tell you, my boss told me your project's not a priority. And I can only work on it when I have time. And the fact I'm getting anything at all done on your project is because I like you. But I'm telling you, it's going to continue to be great. That's all I needed to know, because now I can go to my sponsor and I can figure out how to get you reallocated back to my project to get somebody else, or, whatever those next steps need to be. But without that trust and that transparency, I would have known that. I would have just gotten I'm doing what I can. Right. And it would have been stonewalling.
Right.
So clearly communication is important, as you just alluded to. And we opened this podcast with the George Bernard Shaw quote. The single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And I'm wondering then, in your opinion, what role does effective communication play in successful projects? And how do you make sure that communication is taking place? In other words, that people have received the message you said in the way in which you intended.
Yeah. So I'm a huge believer of writing out what your plan is, right? And people laugh at me because I'll build a communication plan for just about anything, if we're being honest. But for exactly that reason, right? Like really just super basic, business comms 101, like who's my audience, right? And really thinking through, to your point, what do I need to land with them? This isn't about, I need them to get a newsletter. This isn't about, I'm going to do my weekly project comms. I need to think every single time and lay out at the beginning of my project, what is the message that I need them to get? Not what is the subject line of the email, but what is the message that needs to land with them? And then I start building out my comms around that. And sometimes it is project updates, and they're written a certain way, and they're written a different way based on the audience and based on the message that I need them to get, or based on the support that my project team needs, right? Sometimes it's a much softer way. I do this thing with my teams, project teams and other teams, or we kind of go this thing we call a witness list, right? Where we'll sit down and we'll say, okay, who is all in for this project of all the people that are engaged in it, all of our sponsors, our supporters, our team members, who's in? Who's on the cusp of being in, and who do we know is out? Who do we know is actively, no matter what we do, pulling the tiny frayed strings that could possibly be hanging, and that we're going to spend more time managing than we have to spend, right? Like at the end of the day, that does not need to be what my project team is doing. And so we'll make that list, and we will make an active campaign of who's going to spend time with that person. What is it we need them to know? Who's going to get them, into the right call? Who's going to have them really engage better? Is it a matter of, hey, I am going to have to talk to their boss, right? Like sometimes it is. I'm not going to act like this is all warm and fuzzy. Like we all know it is not all warm and fuzzy. You have to go and say, you know what? George over here is not bought in. He was there at the beginning. He shook his head and nodded as if he was bought in, but he's over here pulling the strings. It's derailing. It's detracting. It's taking away. let's try this first with George. But if that doesn't work, I'm going to have to talk to George's boss and find out, is it actually George's boss that's not in, right? Sometimes you figure out it's not the person you're engaging with. It's 3 above them, 3 around them. You took their funds, you took their money, you got prioritized over that, whatever it is, right? Whatever the political mechanism is that got you there. But we have that and we will do it a few times throughout a project. And the team loves it because they're like, oh, so-and-so's over in this kind of, they're a witness now. And when I say witness, this is, whether it's your career or your project, right? This is the person that when you're not in the room, but your stuff comes up, whether it's your resume or your project or where things are at, those people are going to be like, great team, great job, great project, great person, great whatever, right? They get it. And so we do sort of active sessions of who's in this bucket that needs to be moved over and what is that specific communication that's going to work with them and needs to land them to get them where we need them to be.
Right. No, that's wonderful. Are you ever able to move people from the detractor category over to the witness? Or I'm going to knock on some kind of wood here next to me. We typically move, I would say 98% of them, because it is an active campaign of understanding why they're against it. And like I said, you find out like, oh, well, because my project got shelved for this one and I'm mad, I'm angry. And I don't want you to be successful because somehow you being successful means that my project really wasn't as important. Okay. So what can I do for you in that moment? Right? Let's see. Well, I can make you understand why mine got prioritized first. I can walk you through the decision process that happened at the executive level. I can tell you, I will absolutely, if your project is good, like assuming that this is a good project, I will absolutely advocate for you. I will talk about why this should be next. Let's look at your project and see what the ties into our project are. Is this something that is needed, right? Where is that overlap? Where does it fit in the strategy? Let me help you understand why the strategy is here and your project is over here. And let's talk about something that you could do that focuses on the strategy. Like it allows all of that dialogue because you figure out why they're a detractor. And when you do that, again, 98% of the time, they stop pulling the little threads and they get on board. Now, 2% are just angry people who are never going to be happy. And that we need to replace on our project.
And at the end of the day are not worth the effort that you put in. And those are typically the 2% where you do go and ask for a replacement. Like if they have any sort of toxicity, you have to replace them because
you have to wall them off. Or
you do.
Yeah, poison the rest.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's funny because when I teach classes, and a lot of times, as you know, we'll teach 2 days and then we'll go and do a 3-day planning session right behind it so they can see it in their environment, in their world, with their language and their challenges. And what I find is the people that are most vocal in the class about this is never going to work, at the end of that week, when they've been through a project, they all of them will say, we should do this on every project. It's amazing how they become the converts and become like you said, the witnesses for moving forward.
Yeah.
And also, if I look at what you're saying, obviously the podcast is called The Conversation. And that's really what I believe the secret sauce is to the process that you and I both use. And that is we're having conversations to build and agree on the scope up front. And that's a conversation. To your point, we want people to argue. We want you to get your argument out so that you can either get on board or we can figure out where you're coming from and help resolve that. We build a plan, the sticky note you were alluding to earlier in the network diagram. We build that through a conversation of, okay, what happens next? Who's going to own this? How long do you need? And then you mentioned early on in the podcast about the weekly meetings or the biweekly meetings to update the plan. That also is done through a conversation of when you're going to be done. What can I do to help you? And so we find that conversations really help get everybody on board. It forces the collaborative piece to happen, which is so important in the process that we use. And it's really how you get stuff done is through the conversations.
It is. And I think that's the part where you build that relationship, right? It's not, hey, let me check a box. It's not about checking a box. I can check boxes all day long, but it is. And I think that conversation up front that you talked about, anytime I start it with a new company or a new job, my first thing is, hey, we need to implement kind of this charter process because I don't know how any of us are going to get anything done if we don't have that conversation. If I don't recognize that here's the strategic goal of this company and where we're headed. And here's how the work I do fits. And here's how it needs to play out in order to actually get where we're going. And here's everything that everybody believes is part of it. My favorite conversations are scope conversations because they're so amusing, right? It's the what is out of scope that tends to be, the most fun. Like, oh, you thought no, okay. So, hey, we're going to launch this product and it includes 13 kinds of customer experience processes and blah, blah, blah. You're like, the tech guys are like, no, I was just going to get that thing out over here, right? Like I thought that's what we were doing. And I think what I love about that conversation is everybody gets the, oh my gosh, this is way bigger than we thought on day one, instead of, 5 days before they're supposed to implement. And they're like, oh, wow, wait, this is what I signed up for. This is way bigger than I thought. This is nuts. Like, again, the conversation, right, drives you to understanding that on day 1, day 2, day 3 of that session, so that everybody marches out of there going, okay, so this is a lot. And I got to figure out what a lot means. And then that's where the work begins.
And I think a lot of people value that conversation. They value the fact they came in knowing that they're asking for the moon and they don't realize it. And at the end of the day, as a company, if you're a for-profit company, you're only going to make money if the team can deliver on what's being promised. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's so important. Okay. So let's talk about measuring and managing timelines. Cause I know it's probably people want to run from the room screaming now, but it's so important because the planning is only good to get you started, and you gotta adjust and make the course corrections throughout the process because nothing ever goes exactly as planned. So they say when you're if you're in service and you go into war, your plan doesn't last past the first bullets flying. But same thing is in projects. I know you used to be out in Colorado, and when I would go out to Charter or Comcast and teach classes out there, because I think y'all both are in the Inglewood area, mm-hmm. You can see the mountains in the background. And if you want to make your ascent to the top, more than likely you have to have a plan for how you're going to make it and come back. Mm-hmm. And that plan probably doesn't survive perfectly the whole time because the trail you were going to take got washed out or whatever. You don't give up. You just figure out what am I going to do now to get from where I'm at to where I want to be? And it's the same thing in project work. Right. That you may be going down a path that you thought was going to work and you realize this is not working. We have to regroup, recalibrate, do something different. So when you're looking at timelines, how do you keep your team on pace and how do you make sure that everybody is going to hit the deadline?
Yeah. So again, I think it starts with what we said before. Everybody has to be bought in. They have to agree that this was where we were going to start and this is what it was going to take. And then it is that weekly conversation of realizing when things are going to be heading off. And sometimes it's, things that the project team can see coming, but there are those times where, hey, we have a strategic initiative at a company level that the street has now reprioritized, that now comes in over the top, that changes everything, right? And part of that means going back, and this is, this can be frustrating to people, but going back to that, what you and I would call a charter, or somebody would call it project, onboarding document. Like there's lots of names for what different things are, but we would call it a charter and say, okay, so what changed there, right? Like, let's make sure we have that conversation again and get everybody realigned with what it is. And I think that's the part that people don't usually do. I think they just think, oh, let's course correct and everybody will kind of fall in place or we'll get on board, right? But you need to make sure that everybody understands what they're saying is happening and that we all agree that that's happening, because you may see it different than me. You may be like, hey, that path washed out. And I'd be like, well, yeah, but we were going over the bridge anyway, so we're fine, right? Like in our head, we might see two different problems. And so the first thing before I'm doing anything with the timeline is I'm making sure everybody understands what it means to the overall project. In terms of the team and the pace, it's interesting in today's world of being hybrid or remote. Pace is a different conversation, I think, than it was 4 years ago, when everybody was in the office and you got in there and you got in your war room and you redid stuff and everybody's there. And then all of a sudden you're trying to figure out how to war room on Teams and you're trying to figure out how to show somebody a network diagram. You're trying to figure out how you're really sharing critical path and see everybody's faces, because a lot of it, right? A lot of it's just even that understanding your team enough to know when somebody sits back a couple inches, right? Or somebody's not talking, or you can read the body language, you can read the room because you kind of know your team and you know where somebody's not ready to go faster. I think in today's environment, the thing that we spend a lot of time doing is really reassessing. We do constant reassessment of, okay, this is the timeline, but like, where are you? What else is coming on the plate? What else is getting in the way? What else could be the problem? What else, so that we can continue to say, this is the pace we want for this. So if this is the pace we want for this, what else has to go by the wayside? How do we continue to clear that path so that if I need you to hit the gas harder, I'm not sending you into oncoming traffic. Like, how do we keep you in that lane going that pace? And so, for me in this environment where I don't have my team with me, my team is virtually everywhere. We travel a lot. We do a lot of support nationally. We spend our time together in person and on team. So if I happen to be with them traveling, okay, let's talk about what's in the way. Let's talk about what's in the way for you. How do I make sure that you are 100% focused and committed where I need you to be? But I, as a leader, have to be the one to do that.
Right. And I like what you said early on too, about the fact that you go back to the scope document or the onboarding document or whatever, SOW, whatever people want to call it. Because I think what happens is the customer might want to change and people roll their eyes. But to me, the customer has every right to ask for a change, as long as the team has the same right to say, no problem, we can do that. We're going to need 3 more weeks and it's going to cost $10,000 more. And we only know that by having that stick in the ground, right, against we can measure change, which is the charter document. And then when people say, well, that's not what I signed up for, you're right. Because now you're asking for this other functionality, this other feature, this other thing. And we can do that for you, but it's going to take this much more time and it's going to take this much more money. And that conversation has to happen. Right.
And you have to be willing to recognize that takes a minute too. Right? That doesn't happen at 8 a.m. by 8:15, we've got all this solved. So you also have to make sure that you are building in that time to do that. And that can be scary. I think people are like, oh, I don't have time to do that. I don't have time to do that. It's the same way they say about planning up front, right? I don't have time to do that. No, you don't have time not to do that.
Exactly.
Right?
Because if you don't have time to plan, you're going to have time to fix it.
Right.
You better make time to fix it later.
Exactly.
Well, that concludes part 2 of my conversation with Teresa Lynch, Vice President of the Field Operations at Lennar. Coming up in part 3, Teresa discusses communication strategies to balance team dynamics.
When we think about the internal problems that can arise and how we treat each other, having those guiding principles of how we're going to work through conflicts are really important. And so I tend to start every project with a list of guiding principles.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.